So, if you don't know, Derek Muller is a nationally recognized scholar and law professor now at Notre Dame and specializes in the field of election law. So his research focuses on the role of states in the administration of federal elections, the constitutional contours of voting rights and election administration, the limits of judicial power in the domain of elections, and the Electoral College. So I copied and pasted that right off of his bio on Notre Dame's website. But Derek has published more than 24 academic works. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Additionally, he has been a contributor to CBS News, PBS, C-SPAN, and most recently CNN, where you can find him actually with election coverage during this election season. And he'll give you a sign just to acknowledge that you're watching while he's on there. But Derek has had an incredible career and is considered at the top of his field, and so we are just blessed to have him here tonight. But Derek, along with being thankful for your perspective, your insights, your expertise on the subject of elections, I am more thankful for your heart for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to see his gospel bring true hope and change to the lives who are impacted by that, but also the lives around us in what we might refer to as the body politic. So politics can be a hard topic to discuss with anyone, and I think maybe we can all attest to that, which is why I'm thankful for your ability, Derek, to not just have these conversations, but to have them well. Really well. I got to witness that today at a meeting we had, or a luncheon we had with a group of pastors. We saw it a couple years ago when Derek gave a lecture for Geneva. And it is an incredible model of how to engage on a really hard subject well, but also it's an incredible encouragement. So Derek, thank you that you have made the trip out from South Bend to be here with us tonight. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Derek Muller.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking out some time on a Friday night on a homecoming weekend to come out here. Beautiful sunset, beautiful weather. It's great to be back in Iowa City. And thank you, Brett, for that overly effusive and kind introduction. So the lecture is going to kind of be two parts, the before the colon and the after the colon, thinking about faith in elections and thinking about the church in the present political moment. And part of this, when we talk about faith in elections, this comes from a paper I wrote a few years ago, an essay for the Notre Dame Journal of Law and Public Policy. I presented this at Wheaton a few years ago. I presented a version of it here. I'm going to have a version of that today, but then also thinking about some practical things for folks in the room as you're thinking about the election ahead. Maybe you have some anxiety about the election ahead. How should we be thinking about our role as Christians in the current political moment? So let me start with this. My primary area of research is, you heard, election law. And sometimes I joke in audiences like this. This has nothing to do with Calvinism. This is just about how we go about choosing people who are going to serve in office in the United States. And the number one thing I get when I tell people that I'm in the field of election law is, oh, it must be a really interesting time for you. And in that tone of voice, and in a sense that there's some lament, or that there's a lot of things that they want to say but don't feel are appropriate to say at that moment, right? It's a dynamic field. It is constantly changing. I've been hearing the same thing for 15 years as I've been teaching. It's just something new every year, every cycle. So many of you are not lawyers and have maybe some familiarity with the Constitution and what the Supreme Court does when it comes to elections. But despite the fact that you might have just some familiarity with the Constitution, I think Americans have great attachment to the Constitution of the United States, and for understandable reasons. In Philadelphia in 1787, there was this consensus about what our system of government should look like, and a pretty remarkable consensus at that time. We had a fragile nation after the Revolutionary War. We had Articles of Confederation that weren't really working. And so the notion that there could be some consensus and agreement on a new form of government is a testament really to the resiliency of the United States, of those Americans, those early Americans who were trying this experiment. And it's a testament for how long it has endured as this written constitution that we abide by and that we greatly revere. It's subject to change, it's subject to amendment, but it's not so malleable that it's just a parchment barrier or meaningless. It's an abiding reminder that we are a nation of laws and not a nation of men. And when we think about the Constitution, we probably think about maybe not so much about that 1787 Constitution. We probably spend a lot of time thinking about the amendments to it, especially things like the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and things like that. But the heart of the Constitution lies in some of these sort of brilliant mechanisms, thinking about the enumeration of powers and the separation of powers. Those are the sort of the two hearts of what's happening in this Constitution. So first, when we talk about the enumerated powers in the Constitution, the federal government was going to be terrifically powerful. I mean, it's a government that can conscript citizens into the armed services, can drop the atomic bomb, and can put men on the moon. I mean, it's a powerful, powerful government over the years, as we've seen. So to find these appropriate powers in 1787, to draw this more perfect union, the goal is, what do we have that are sort of those necessary things that will control not just the states, but also the individual people? Because the Articles of Confederation control just the states, so what can control the individual people? And second, and maybe more importantly, is the separation of powers. Power will not be concentrated in any one person. One big goal in our, sort of the Revolutionary War was to say we don't like the monarchy, we don't like sort of having this concentration of power, so we can separate things. And separating the power among branches will have some deliberation. It will require us to slow things down. It will require consensus building. And we'll have checks upon each of these branches of government to protect individual liberty so that the government can't so quickly accumulate power. So this is all well and good, interesting ideas, but more than just those ideas, it's who's going to serve in this government? How should this new government be formed? And it's there that the Constitution spends so much time talking about elections. A lot of things in the Constitution are about elections. It's probably not the first thing you think about, but it was so essential to think about how this new government would be formed. Who serves in Congress? For how long? How are those members of Congress elected? How do we determine who gets to be elected and how many people are elected to Congress? What do those people in Congress get to do? We can ask the same question about the presidency and similar questions, although they're not elected, of the federal courts. Line after line of the Constitution, and if I had all night, I would read through it for you tonight, but we can meticulously plod through the steps for elections. So I'll focus on a different sort of way of thinking about this. When this Constitution was ratified by the people in the states, it guarantees that these political officers will be elected to some degree. Members of the House are elected. The presidency could be elected. Your state legislatures would be elected. And we've slowly migrated from a system where there were some elected officials to a much more robust one of many more forms of election. That is the unmistakable pattern in the 250 years under our Constitution, not exclusively linear, but the pattern we've seen is the expansion of suffrage. More people than ever are eligible to vote, such that we've reached essentially near universal suffrage for adult citizens. More offices than ever are subject to vote, including judges, including those things that we think are the most apolitical of offices, the judiciary. We vote on legislation sometimes because of the ballot initiative, the referendum, amendments to the state constitution. It's easier to vote than it has been at any time in American history. Many states have very robust absentee voting, days of early voting, drop boxes after election day ballot deadlines to receive ballots, generous review of ballots, same-day voter registration, provisional ballots that can be cured, extremely accurate mechanisms to tabulate marked ballots, internet information about how to register, where to register, who the candidates are. And most of this is just in the last 25 years. These are developments that we've seen. And despite the fact that more people than ever vote on more things than ever in more ways than ever, or for some reason in an age of great skepticism. It seems unusual given how much we've expanded the voting opportunities, how much more we participate in the political process, and how much we apparently trust that political process. But maybe it's a different reason why we're skeptical. It's not that we have fewer people participating, we have more. It's not that we have fewer opportunities to participate, we have more. It's instead maybe that the stakes feel so very high. And maybe it's that elected officials do more than ever, do more things than ever, or that we expect them to do more than ever. Or maybe it's because of this intense era of political polarization where it seems like the other political party stands against everything that our political party holds dear. In other words, that we just too easily live lives of fear. So as a scholar of election law, I find the conversations about law increasingly devolving, I would say, into fearful hypotheticals. And it doesn't take very long before you open the latest New York Times or Washington Post or Politico to see some fearful hypothetical about what might happen this November, December, January. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if people seek to abuse the process? How can the law stop it, if at all? The disastrous scenarios just grow. And so I think there's something lurking here. And again, a reason why I talk about this is faith in elections. Because we're suffering a crisis of faith in America, and not necessarily religious faith, although I'm sure some of the theologians and sociologists have thought about that. And so it's the crisis of faith in elections. And recent surveys have shown that a plurality, if not an outright majority of Americans, lack confidence in the honesty of the elections that will take place this term. In 2016, long ago, if you will, 40% of Americans agreed with the statement, "I have lost faith in American democracy." And 2016, feels like a lifetime ago. In 2020, President-elect Joe Biden shared his view that our faith in our institutions has held. But commentators and outlets from The Economist to Bloomberg to NBC News lamented in column after column about the loss of faith in elections, the need to restore faith. And sometimes we take this language to another level. In 2021, the Senate had a hearing, and the hearing was entitled "Protecting a Precious, Almost Sacred Right," the Voting Rights Advancement Act. And Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark testified at that hearing that the right to vote is sacred. These examples only scratch the surface of the language of faith in elections and democracy and the American ideal, words that often arise when someone questions the legitimacy of elections. The language is everywhere, and words, of course, take different meanings in different contexts, but to use the word faith is a choice. It's a choice to invoke religious imagery. And we could use words like trust or confidence or belief, and faith maybe is just a synonym, but there seems to be a stubborn insistence on why are we using that word faith everywhere. It's a word we use elsewhere in government, but not as often. I don't think we very often ask as much about faith in the courts or the presidency, although maybe we do sometimes. I don't think very many of us ask if we have faith in the Department of Motor Vehicles or the faith in the Fish and Wildlife Service, right? It's something else about our democracy or the larger institutions. So as I think about this, I thought about this for some time to say, what is it about this word faith, and how should we be thinking about it both in a religious context and a political context, and is there some difference? So first, when we think about the use of the word faith in religion, right, we can think about this in a few different ways. So one is sort of sociological. I'm an adherent of the Jewish faith, of the Muslim faith, of the Christian faith. I'm a member of this group that has a bunch of ideals that are attached with it. Another is more an epistemological meaning, belief. That is, belief in some proposition. I believe something to be true, to be the case. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity describes this as one of the two ways that Christians think about faith. It's accepting or regarding as true the doctrines of Christianity because the evidence seems to him good or bad. It's adherence to belief based on good evidence. Here's what Lewis says. Now, faith, in the sense in which I'm using the word, is the art of holding on to things that your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. That is why faith is such a necessary virtue. Unless you teach your moods where they get off, You can never be either a sound Christian or even a sound atheist, but just a creature dithering to and fro with its beliefs really dependent on the weather and the state of its digestion. But Lewis also describes another way of thinking about faith. And this is the kind of faith we refer to when we're thinking about faith in Christ. It's another epistemological claim, that is, something trust that somebody will do something, or trust that something will happen. Here, Lewis means that Christians have an inability to achieve eternal salvation on their own power. We are acutely aware that we're incapable of living sinless lives, and we discover our own bankruptcy, the term that he uses. So to have faith in Christ means that we are, quote, creatures related to himself in a certain way. So this portrait of salvation, at the very heart of Christianity, suggests that our identity is attached to someone outside of ourselves. We are reliant on the actions of someone else who will take action on our behalf, and we cannot act on our own. These eternal salvation is going to be dependent on someone else. And we have a faith not just in this being, and not just in the being as being the strongest evidence that he exists, but because it is the only way for us to live. So these are some theological ways of thinking about faith. Very simplified, and I'm sure the theologians and the philosophers in the audience say I've grossly oversimplified things for you tonight. But what do we think about democratic faith, or faith in elections? This word, it's actually not new in the United States. So in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville long ago commented about the similar beliefs or the principal ideas that a society should share to advance together to a common action. He turns to the faith, and he uses this term faith, the faith that the citizens have in each other. The more equal these people are, the less faith they need to have in each other, because they have almost unlimited public confidence in the judgment of the public. If the people of a society view themselves as co-equals, as equal with one another, it means they have confidence in the judgments of the majority. He continues, in the United States, the majority takes charge of providing individuals with a host of ready-made opinions, thus relieves them of the obligation to form for themselves opinions that are their own. A great number of theories and matters of philosophy, morality, and politics are adopted in this way by each person without examination on faith in the public. And if you look very closely, you will see that religion itself reigns there much less as revealed doctrine than as common opinion. So de Tocqueville, long ago, 150 years ago, is writing about faith in a couple of ways. First, confidence in the citizenry, confidence that the citizenry has done things and is doing things. And second, kind of this sentiment of moral certitude about the direction of the country. Faith that the country is moving together in the right direction. And so these two threads really hold up today as we think about it. Faith is used in the context of a narrative. What direction are we going as a country? Where are we headed? In other words, democratic faith looks to the past, to the promises that we made, and looks to the future to ask whether or not those promises are being fulfilled. It's similar to the Christian tradition to think about the past, the creation, the messianic promises, and an anticipation of the future, of redemption, of things to come. So faith isn't just a basket of beliefs, it's sort of a story about our past and future. And political theorists here might use faith in this narrative sense, consistent in some ways with the Christian tradition. Okay, so this is only a little bit, scratching the surface, and this lecture isn't just about faith, it's also about elections. And for a very long time, as I started studying this, I saw how often and how frequently courts in particular, but politicians too, as I cited a couple earlier, use this phrase faith when it comes to thinking about democracy. And they often use it in the sense of confidence in the public's confidence in elections, and the absence of corruption in elected officials. So in one case from the 1960s, the Supreme Court wrote an opinion that said, the statute, this was a campaign finance statute, the statute is directed at an evil which endangers the very fabric of a democratic society, for a democracy is effective only if the people have faith in those who govern. And that faith is bound to be shattered when high officials and their appointees engage in activities which arouse suspicions of malfeasance and corruption. The seriousness of this evil quite naturally led Congress to adopt a statute whose breadth would be sufficient to cope with this evil. That is, malfeasance and corruption in public officials can shatter faith in the people and from those who govern. Democracy is only effective if we have that faith. About 15 years ago, the court, in another decision, was concerned about corporate expenditures, how corporations were spending money in political campaigns. And while they were not coordinated with others, corporations were just spending money on their own, the government expressed concern that it would give rise to the appearance of corruption. People would associate large amounts of money with corruption. But the court said the appearance or influence of influence or access without or will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. As the court's making predictions about what the people will think in reaction to certain things that are happening, reflects the court concerned about people losing faith. There are many more examples I could give. I'll just pause there. But the courts and these judicial opinions all sort of turn on a few things thinking about faith. The first is that it really is echoing a sense of trust. That is, the people trust their local government officials to behave appropriately. And the law should encourage that behavior, but it also reflects, in a different way, distrust. If there's appearance of impropriety, a conflict of interest, an exchange that looks like a bribe, we should prevent even those appearances, because the appearance of corruption can give us a lack of faith. The second is a kind of evidence-based claim. The people have an expectation that their elected officials will behave appropriately. Evidence available to the public supports that view, including an expectation that officials can't receive bribes. They can't always see what officials are doing. Officials are engaged in conduct behind closed doors at times, but the people expect their elected officials to behave appropriately, and they'll sustain those expectations until evidence is introduced indicating that these elected officials have engaged in malfeasance or corruption. So public displays of conduct should demonstrate appropriateness of conduct. That instills faith because of the evidence of the things that we see. And the third is a concept of faith closer to Lewis's conception of it. That is, we have a special relationship with our elected officials. We elect officials to represent us. They act in our interest. They act in the interests of the nation. But they often act outside of our sight. We rely on them to work things out to benefit us. We trust them to do the right thing, to abide by their promises, to act in our best interest, admitting that sometimes there can be tension, and sometimes these goals can contradict each other. And these reactions from the court are about democracy, much broader than just thinking about elections. But there's this persistent concern about how representative government works with us. But it's consistent with this narrative concept. There are promises in the Constitution, and we should expect some preservation of these good things of the past and some growth toward a better future. Some are worried that decisions by elected officials can undermine those promises. Others worry that the future will not really benefit us in the ways that we are hoping. It might be that faith in democracy or elections means that the people assume certain things have to exist for this democracy to work out. A lack of corruption, whatever it might be. And that if we don't have faith, perhaps there's no democracy. Perhaps there's nothing for us to put our confidence in. So there are a few things to think about here as we're using this term faith in elections. The first is it's not clear that when the courts use this language like faith, that it's terribly helpful. That is, when you have this religious imagery for a decidedly non-religious end, perhaps we should be thinking about some more precise terms. We want public trust in the good motives of elected officials. We want public assurance that officials are acting with impartiality. We want public confidence in the outcomes of elections. Those are the things we really want to see: assurance, confidence, and trust. And so maybe it would be helpful for courts to be more precise, for our elected officials to be more careful in the words that they're using. Given the many ways we can think about using the word faith, perhaps we should be a little bit more cautious. Another is a risk of conflating these sort of sacred terms with earthly ends. The word faith is a powerful word. It's undoubtedly why it's used so often rhetorically to convey something significant. It's been popular to view these democratic institutions as something sacred. And if they're sacred, we want to use sacred language like faith around them. And politicians or journalists may well prefer to use that language. But we might want to think about moving away from it. Courts play an important role in interpreting these laws, but adopting religious language starts to tread on holy ground, if you will, to take religious metaphors and use them for worldly things. Regardless of the language we use, though, one is a concern about language, but another is that we are witnessing a migration away from confidence, if we're going to use that word, in our elections. Rather than merely hope that faith will be restored, we're seeing efforts to bring better evidence to the public, precisely because the public does not need to rely on faith on things they can't see. Maybe we need to learn a little more from the Apostle Thomas. Maybe we need to acknowledge that elections, unlike the resurrection, are things to be run by sight and not necessarily by faith. Scholars have called for increasing transparency in how election observers witness the events of the counting of ballots, transparency in how we draw districts for Congress, for our legislatures, transparency in election results, paper ballot requirements, risk-limiting audits. These are very specific requirements now to think about increasing trust in the outcomes of elections. It remains to be seen whether more transparency is going to lead to better outcomes or greater trust in things, but they undoubtedly reflect the notion that the status quo is inadequate for the present age. And finally, a recommendation for people of religious faith, or here the church, right? Christians are called to respect government and ruling authorities, and I don't have to spend a lot of time proof texting those materials for you tonight, but it's worth recognizing the fallibility of these democratic institutions, because they are still just worldly institutions. And one might think about Psalm 146:3 here. Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man, in whom there is no salvation. Consider the words from the theologian Oliver O'Donovan in The Ways of Judgment, who shares 3 ways in which human political judgment is limited. First, not everything known can be publicly expressed and certified. Second, judgment has only certain modes of expression open to it. And third, it lacks final authority. That is, there are limitations to how well human institutions can work. To return to the notion of faith in something, our faith should be in Christ and not in the things of this world. And maybe this sounds a little bit gloomy, at least gloomy to those who maybe trust is in the things of this world. But it's not meant to be a sort of fatalism for people of faith, a resigned attitude that our democratic institutions are inherently fallen. There are good reasons to work to root out fear in this world, to live worthy lives in this world. We are flesh and blood beings in this place at this time. We need not be resigned to crumbling institutions around us. Reliable elections, actually reliable and perceived as reliable, can redound to people of faith. Christians are called to submit to governmental authorities, and it's obviously easier to submit to a legitimate regime. It calls fewer questions about obedience than when we doubt the legitimacy of our government. And let's remember that we're called to fear not those who can kill the body but not kill the soul. So it's just a reminder that democratic institutions aren't perfect. Elections aren't flawless, but we can have confidence in elections, at least as much confidence as worldly institutions can hold. Elections in the United States have extensive checks, robust judicial review, increasing transparency, and we might simply want to reduce some of the reliance on the language of faith. We can think about all these things, and this is sort of more the academic side of thinking about it, but also some perspectives to think about how faith, democracy, and religious institutions work together. But I also wanted to, and as I spoke with Brett about this lecture, I wanted to add the proviso, the church in the present political moment, because some of you might get through this and say, that doesn't tell me who I'm supposed to vote for, right? And sadly, I'm not going to tell you that, so we're not going to get there. It's hard on a stage in having these conversations we're talking about politics when people are a little bit on edge, and you're a little bit on edge to say, I wonder what he's going to say and how much I can disagree with and grumble about in my car on the ride home, right? But when we're having these conversations about elections, it's not sort of en masse, I think, that can be most effective. It really is in one-on-one conversations where you're developing trust, understanding where people are, and trying to help them understand ideas or exchange ideas or view what are the concerns they have or the limitations they have in certain contexts. So I'm going to close. I still have a little ways to go, but I'm going to close with this. I have 7 truths and 3 questions to offer for discernment tonight. 7 truths and 3 questions to think about this present political moment. The 7 truths I hope will be helpful to think about how elections operate in this particular election, but it doesn't have to just be this particular election. The first is this: your presidential vote is likely your least consequential vote. That's a little bit provocative, so I hope you don't mind me saying that, right? And I say it in this way. We have a very large country with a very large number of voters. And there's no question that we spend the most time of our media coverage talking about presidential elections. But simply as a matter of, you can put it as mathematics, statistics, political science, whatever it might be. You are voting in a statewide election in Iowa or elsewhere if you're a visitor, one of millions of votes in a location, and votes that only affect, in Iowa, 6 electoral votes, a handful of electoral votes. So in some respects, while there's so much attention focused on presidential elections, in some respects it is the least consequential because of the role that your vote has in the context. So it's probably the kind of vote that you spend the most time agonizing about, and yet I want to offer at least a little bit of perspective there. And there's no question we spend a lot of time thinking about presidential elections. And it's very strange, at least for the framers of the Constitution, because for the framers of the Constitution, they spent a lot of time thinking about Congress, which they thought was by far the most dangerous branch. They spent a very long time enumerating all the things it could do and giving a lot of details about what it could do. So why is it that we obsess so much over presidential elections? It's a variety of things in the present age. I think one is we have a legislature much less interested in doing its job than it was a generation or 2 ago. We have so much that we expect the executive to do by executive order, executive fiat. There's so much we expect administrative agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, whatever it might be, staffed with members of the president's choice. There's so much we expect the judiciary to do. And the judiciary is made up of judges appointed by the president. And the president has a tremendous bully pulpit to be able to stand up and speak to the public, to the world, on so many things. So we've put so many things into the president's basket, sort of atrophying so many other aspects of government, and particularly in the last generation, perhaps why it feels so acute to us in the present age. That's not to say that it's an unimportant office. It's certainly an important office. But thinking about our role, about my vote, in some respects it is the least consequential in terms of effect. So the second is to recognize that your local vote matters a great deal. The local vote, again, thinking from a political science or a statistics perspective, your vote is one of a much smaller group of people in your municipality, in your city, in your county. It's going to be a much smaller opportunity to elect your state representative, to have a voice heard for retaining the judges in your jurisdiction, whoever it might be. And when you think so much, we think so much of what the president does, but we can think so much of what your local officials do, right? Think about the school board and the education policies that are affecting not just your children, but your neighbor's children, and really the children who will grow up into the next generation. Think about the policies that were enacted during the pandemic and the things that you supported or you opposed, or in retrospect, you support or oppose in light of what happened, right? So many things that deeply and intensely affect us as individuals happen at the local level. And it's hard to get invested in those things when so much of it's so easy to find out things about the presidential race and so hard sometimes to find out about the local elections. But the second truth that I encourage you to think about is that there really is an opportunity to invest and to think about those local matters, which can be so much more influential in many respects. The third is that every candidate is flawed because they are human beings and they are sinful like you and me, right? And yes, some are more flawed than others. There is no question about that. But we want to think separately about the people who are going to be role models in our lives and the people who maybe we rely upon for a wide variety of things. There's no question that we often look at a sports star, at a movie star, at a musician, and there's a part of us that's attracted to their talent and a part of us repulsed by their personal behavior. And that's a very hard thing to do and to separate at times. And at times when we are electing candidates, we are not electing pastors, we are not electing saints, we are electing politicians, each of whom is sinful and flawed. That puts us in a very difficult position because I think for a very long time we have anticipated that these are role models, and maybe in different places we have thought about some elected officials as role models. But it can put us in a difficult situation to recognize that so often they are flawed human beings and candidates. The fourth is to realize that you do have the opportunity not to vote. But failing to vote for a candidate is something like half a vote for their opponent. This sounds a little bit strange, right? But when we think about this from a political science perspective, imagine the election is 50 votes to 49 votes. If you were to vote for that 50, you were to be the 50th voter. Instead, you flipped your vote to the other side, what happens? Be 49 to 50. That's very easy, right? And the other candidate wins. But imagine you just didn't vote. It would be 49 to 49, effectively half of the effect of if you had flipped your vote. So when we think about voting, if you think that there are two candidates who you really dislike, okay, but realize that failing to vote for one of them is probably half a vote for the other. And that's a consequence of not voting. So it's entirely, I tell people, if you want to vote, that's great. I encourage you to do so. You should think about it. You should really think about how to cast your vote. But I also realize that there's no question people at times have moral qualms about it. But it's worth thinking about how the fact that sometimes inaction is in fact action, that inaction does have consequences. So realize that if you choose to abstain, that there are consequences to that action. The fifth is that we must obey God. That's Acts 5:29. This is a time of year where a lot of times people will probably want to talk about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God. But I like to come to Acts 5:29 instead and say, we must obey God rather than man. I think that is our obligation first and foremost. We can often submit to worldly authorities, and there's no question we're supposed to submit to worldly authorities. But we need to spend our time and focus on our obedience to God. And that takes a lot of discernment and humility and discipline and prayer, but the place where we should be having our mindset first and foremost, because that is our obligation. The sixth is to have, what has quickly become one of my favorite proverbs, if not one of my favorite verses in the Bible, a Proverbs 18:17 mindset. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. So often, you hear something, you read something, you see something, and you are inclined to think that is correct. Maybe because it comes from a friend or a person you like or a worldview or a perspective that you are inclined to support. But coming out of law school, there's one thing that we learn in law, which is to think about cross-examination, thinking about the other side's arguments. There are so many times in my classes where students are reading judicial opinions, they read the majority opinion, oh yeah, that's so persuasive. And then they read the dissenting opinion. Oh, that's really persuasive too, and they left out a lot of things that the majority said. Or jurors sitting there hearing a case where one person gets up and presents evidence, boy, that sounds really persuasive, until the other side has a chance to be heard. And so often we hear one side, or are willing to only hear one side, or talk to only people from one side, or to share or quickly share on social media or among our friends, or forward the email the one side of the story. But in order for us to really get at the truth, we have to spend time examining the other side, other people's motives, other people's intentions, other facts, other contingencies. So be scrupulous, be skeptical, and engage to think about both sides before coming to a conclusion. And then finally, that we are in the world, but not of the world. Of course, it's an important distinction that Scripture puts there for us. to recognize that we should avoid, I think, the sort of twin faults of being so despondent that we just ignore politics, or being so singularly obsessed with them that we sort of fall into ruin. We are in the world and must engage in certain things about the world, including the political realm, including elections and how we vote. But at the same time, we are not to be of the world and so bought into its terms and what it means for us. So those are 7 truths that I hope you can think about as some different kinds of anchors and perspective as you move forward in this election season, and how Christians should be thinking and engaging about these issues. But as you are weighing things this fall, maybe many of you have voted, in which case this can just be a burden off you, or you can say, oh, now I wish I'd done this. Let me offer 3 questions for you to think about. 3 questions for you to think as you are engaging with candidates. And this goes from president and vice president to your dog catcher, right? And everything in between to think about these candidates. First, what do I think are the most greatest and most pressing issues in which candidates are likely to support the solutions to those issues that I endorse? That puts the issues in front of the candidate. And it's hard because when we talk about issues, there's probably a knee-jerk reaction you have about what the most important issues are. But I think that this requires some self-reflection and some meditation. In your gut, your reaction might be the most important issues affect my pocketbook. They affect my wallet. And maybe that's true at the end of the day upon some self-reflection and some meditation. But as Christians, we should be cautious about that and think carefully, cautiously, holistically, because all voting is a trade-off. No candidate is going to perfectly embody all of our preferences. So sometimes we have to make prioritizations. Sometimes we have to evaluate and weigh these things. And it's worth thinking about solutions broadly. As we evaluate what are those most important issues, solutions don't just come from the president. They're not just executive policies. They don't necessarily happen at the federal level. They can be laws from the legislative branch. They can be judicial opinions from the judges they choose at the federal level, the judges chosen at the state level, the judges we retain at the state level, about who has similar philosophies interpreting the Constitution, interpreting the laws. They can be used at the bully pulpit, what they are saying, how they are speaking, the kinds of issues that candidates choose to support or endorse. So we want to prioritize with self-reflection, what are the things that I think are the greatest issues, thinking from a Christian perspective, and then who is going to support the solutions to those issues that I think are most important and correct. The second, even if I have grave doubts about candidates, do I believe that candidates will surround themselves with people I do have confidence in? Scripture is filled with instances of God elevating people from their stations into positions of leadership, and that's done by the work of God's sovereign hand, but it also requires in part some interest of the leader to do so. When it's Pharaoh who elevates Joseph, when it's Daniel who sits beside Nebuchadnezzar, when Xerxes grants a reprieve to Esther, there are some wicked and vile rulers in the history of the people of Israel. And yet, despite the fact that they have this control, they did at time, through God's sovereign will, elevate Israelites around them. This extends for candidates for who's going to be on their staff, who they're going to put into agencies, who the judges are around them, and so on. That's not to say that anyone wanted to, I think, elect Nebuchadnezzar out of the people of Israel. No one wants to elect the king of Babylon to enslave your people. The metaphor only really goes halfway. And what we know, that varying people are always put into positions of power. They are counselors to those elected officials. And we may not be happy with them. But we also know that God can work with them, even the wicked ones. And one way he might work through those rulers is through the people they surround themselves with. So it's another angle to think about in this election season. The third, do I think this candidate will allow space and accommodation for diverse religious beliefs, particularly if they do not agree with them? We're in a precarious place as a nation right now, and I'm sure to those of you in the room, especially who are medical doctors in the medical field, you might feel it more acutely than others. There are a wide range of matters where it can feel, at times, increasingly challenging to live faithfully as a Christian. And if government orders us to do certain things in ways that run afoul of our sincerely held beliefs, we may find ourselves in increasingly difficult positions. And again, in an Acts 5:29 mindset, we are ultimately called to obey God rather than man. And we may well face persecution for our faith, and people around the globe do that. And they face persecution much more intense and severe than maybe many of us, or certainly I, could readily accept. But if we value, I think, the commitments, for instance, the First Amendment, if we value the commitments of sort of the tradition of natural rights brought in from the Protestant tradition, we value those things that are thinking about how pluralism, the ability of religions to flourish and thrive alongside each other, and people of good faith to engage in disagreement while living their lives in harmony with one another. We want to be asking ourselves about candidates who are going to allow us to flourish and thrive even in the face of intense disagreement. So those are a few questions I would encourage you to think about and to ask when you're dealing with different candidates this particular election season. And it's not so much that we are in a terrible moment of political turmoil. There are far worse instances in American history. In 1860, I would venture to say, starting the Civil War, in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's election, was a far darker moment for thinking about politics in the United States. But I think we've sort of come through a moment where, whether you can say the 70s, 80s, and 90s were a period of some relative peace when it comes to our political order, and the last generation somewhat a crescendoing of a lot of the challenges of the political process, we might find ourselves in a new era and a new downswing where things will restore back to normal at some point, or where things will continue to acutely get worse. But I strongly encourage you to recognize that your faith is not in this world. Your faith is in Christ, and to maintain that perspective this election season. Thank you.
So now we're going to transition. We're going to transition to a time of Q&A. So again, if you have a question, you can go to one of the mics to ask your question. John is gracious enough to moderate. And then if you don't have the ability to go to the mic, you can bring the mic.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Muller, for your insights, your thoughts and your points, your questions there at the end. So as we're kind of getting settled in, I think I'll take the opportunity to ask the first question,
Sure.
and then hopefully we'll have a good stream of audience members. And I can just sit here and listen to your answers. So you came here about a year and a half ago and gave a talk about faith in elections. Mm-hmm. And something you said in that talk that I wrote down, I'm going to throw it back at you. You said, as
that's dangerous.
A scholar of election law,
yeah.
I'm getting into conversations about the law that are increasingly devolving into fearful hypotheticals.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you if you still thought that, but then you said the exact same line tonight. So I think you do. And so it's not just devolving, but you've said increasingly devolving, right? Yeah. So it's almost like an accelerating problem. And so related to that, there's a sign on Benton Street crossing the river, and I didn't have it exactly in my mind until this moment, so I might be slightly wrong, but it says vote the issues. Maybe you've seen it around town. And it has a list of what you would expect to be the typical issues. But right in the middle of the list, it says saving democracy as an issue.
Yeah.
And that always strikes me as like, that's one of the issues on the ballot in their mind these days. So it seems like that's evidence of like a pretty big fear, right? Or like a loss of faith in democracy, that we might lose democracy. But there's a paradox there, because they are also saying that the solution to losing democracy is democracy, right? Is voting. Vote the issues. And so I guess I'm wondering if we have a solution to this problem, or if it will continuously, increasingly devolve, that like maybe we're getting too big as a country, too diverse, too divided. That is there hope for democracy? Like, will our faith be restored someday? Are we in a downswing, or what do you see?
Yeah.
What do you see coming?
There's about 8 different ways I could go there. Let me try.
So that was a lot.
No, this is a great law student question. This is why it happens this way. So there's a few pieces to this. So one is I get a little nervous that the word democracy is thrown around a lot today to kind of mean things I like. And the people who oppose democracy are in support of things I don't like. And that becomes like a hard kind of framing of how things work. So that's one like challenge to thinking about it. We have a democratic order. We have opportunities to vote. We have the right to vote. It's happening right now. It's going to occur. There will be winners and losers. People will take office consistent with those rules. Like the law is going to have answers for all this stuff. Like on the law side, it clearly has answers. When I read, some of the hypotheticals, people either have to like find the most absurd scenarios in order to like they have to label things loopholes or it's possible, or they sort of have to get to a situation where the law runs out, okay, where the law just runs out, and by that I mean, so we can talk about the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. I can't give you like legal answers to that, right? If mobs do something, it's extra legal, and like the law professor and me, I can give you lots of answers about what 3 U.S.C. 5, about different federal statutes have to do. But there are places where sometimes the law runs out. And if we're dealing with civil disorder, civil disobedience, whatever it might be, I don't have great answers. So that's a hard place to be. When it comes to like thinking about democracy, on the one hand, I think there are a lot of people who criticize Republicans for, I'm going to use Republicans and Democrats now. People getting a little nervous now. Criticize Republicans for not adhering to election results, sowing skepticism, sowing doubt. These are the things that are sort of the lead of the newspaper. For Democrats, it's a lot of, we need to change the court, we need to abolish the Electoral College, we need to abolish the Senate, we need to do all these different things structurally. You can say, well, those all things, like those are 2 very different ways of approaching things, and 2 very different ways of sort of changing up the order of thinking about how things are operating. But there's also this sort of dissatisfaction of losing or being unable to win, whichever way you want to put it. And when we create sort of this zero-sum game where it's an existential crisis, which is what so much of the rhetoric is, right? The most important election of our lifetime. The republic will no longer exist if my candidate loses, all these kinds of things. It puts us in a very dark place, because then it is saving democracy. That if you're voting for the wrong side, like, our democratic order is over, and it's never going to be restored. So that's a dark place to be. It's a hard thing to think about. It's a place where we have very little consensus anymore, where there's the ability to have coalitions. And I think, part of this is the intense polarization, but, a generation ago, you would have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Like, those were things in Congress. Those people were there. They're not really there anymore, and so the coalition building becomes much harder to create. So all that is to say, it's not a good place to be, and it's a reason why my goal is to tone down the rhetoric, to try to calm people down and engage in those conversations, even if we might be intense about our preferences, our own political preferences, to think about how we can have those conversations in a more appropriate setting. But in terms of the size of the country, there's something to be said about this conversation, about can we really self-govern at 350 million people? Where we don't have trust, we're not watching 3 nightly news broadcasts, but curated content designed for us 1,000 people at a time. It's a very hard place to be. Let's put it that way. Sorry, that was a lot of answers to a lot of questions.
I'd love to go on. Got to pass it along. Let's start over here, and then we'll kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, thanks for your lecture, and I appreciate your approach to political discussion. I was a little surprised by what you said. I think it was under the heading or the third or fourth point you were making about character. And you made the analogy, let's say you've got a wonderful violinist who is also a vile person in a lot of ways. Well, you probably shouldn't judge his or her talent as a musician in terms of the way in which they treat their kids. But I think the political context is quite different. Plato, in the Republic, spent a great deal of time reflecting on the question, what makes a good leader? And his answers, if one can summarize them in 2 words, are wisdom and character. And you, in your response to his previous question, said quite, I think, tellingly and insightfully, sometimes the law runs out. And that's where wisdom has to step in, isn't it? So I wonder if you'd be willing to recant what you said about character, or at least nuance it.
No, thank you. So I don't think I said, I try not to use the word character. I think I said everyone is flawed. I think we recognize that. And everyone is sinful. And it's hard. And there are trade-offs whenever you're electing somebody. And we're going to be thinking about lots of things that we want to do and want to have in elected officials. Now, let me say, I think wisdom is important. I think character is important. So I will say that. I think character is important. But I do think sometimes if you are choosing between people, sometimes the character is not what you want it to be. Sometimes you are weighing character with a lot of other traits and considerations. And I understand that we can say that there's maybe that Plato thinks that there, or Socrates, I should say, or thinks that there are 2 in particular that sort of control the rest of them. But I think, sometimes part of prudence and judgment is weighing a lot of a significant series of trade-offs, and that's hard. So I want to say that I will not say character is unimportant. Character is something we should think about, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, you're right, it's hard. That's why it seems to me wisdom is a most important characteristic.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you. Let's go over here.
Yes, I have 2 questions. One is, would you tell us why the electorate is important? And secondly, can you describe for us the certification process?
Yeah, so why the electorate is important? So, the electorate is us. In the United States, we believe in popular sovereignty. We believe that we, the people, are sovereign, and therefore the electorate, the vast majority of us, are the ones who participate in that political process. So we being the sovereign and we being the ones who are participating and where sort of government is derived from under our American system, that's what makes us the electorate important. When it comes to certifying elections, I could spend 3 hours on that, I suppose, but certification is really this process, the legal term here to use is ministerial, and by ministerial I mean non-discretionary. So in law you can think about things that you have discretion to do and things that are non-discretionary. And what happens on election night is you have all these precincts that have their votes, and they send them to the county. And the county at some point has to add up all those sheets and then send them to the state, and the state has to add them up. And really that process is called certification. And by ministerial, it means you are basically doing arithmetic. And sometimes there's a problem. If you have 18 precincts in your county and you've only got 17, there's a problem, and we need to get the 18th precinct in there before I certify. Or if I've got a precinct that reports 0 votes, I probably should go check that out. Or if the precinct reports 1 million votes in a city with 1,200 people, I probably need to check that out, right? There are a few things that we'd say on the face of the returns, on the surface of the returns. But certification is really a process of just making sure we have all the paperwork together and we've checked the boxes. Because other people earlier in the process, and I've worked in Iowa as an election official, I've worked in Iowa, I've run a precinct in an election. I have a lot of responsibilities early in the process, and there are other people that have responsibilities later in the process. But certification is kind of this last stage, this last check to make sure that all of the ones and zeros are there, that we've added things up and kind of can move the machine along.
So you spoke yesterday at the law school, just a little more focused on something like the law.
A lot of law.
But you did talk about the process of, like, there's the election.
Yeah.
Right, and then the Electoral College meets, and then there's 4 steps that you were talking about until we get to finally January 6th, which we all unfortunately know now. But so nowadays, there's this expectation, I think, that election night we find out the winner, right? But there's actually, like, people are still turning in ballots through the mail. They have to be postmarked by Election Day. Like, they're not really added up until December 17th. Is that right?
Sometimes a little bit earlier, but yeah.
December 11th, they need to have it. So I think I expect to know, like, by the time I wake up the next morning, right, who won. But that's not really how it was intended. And is that expectation more like just 21st century? Or when did that come about? And can you speak to a little bit, like, when do we actually know?
There's a difference between when we know and when we know. So for a very long time, we used to get election results probably faster in some respects in some more recent elections. What has happened is we've, as part of my lecture pointed out, we've dramatically expanded the number of opportunities to vote. That's just added a lot of complexity to our election process. So there's good things about that because there's more opportunity. There's bad things because there's more complexity. So sometimes this can slow things down. In 2020 in particular, when there was so much absentee voting because of COVID, so many people voting because they want to stay at home and stay safe, we had this dramatic uptick in all this vote by mail stuff. And counting absentee ballots is just so much slower than counting ballots on Election Day. On Election Day, you have one piece of paper, you run it through the machine, easy. With absentee ballots, I got an envelope, I got to open the envelope, I got to give it to somebody else who takes it out of the secrecy sleeve, they have to flatten it, it might be ripped, it might be torn, because you have no idea what human beings do with their ballots at home, right? And then they have to run it through the machine. And if they're not able to process them in advance, which in some states they can't, it just takes a lot longer. So we just saw all of that coming to a head, especially in 2020. And so some states like Florida have had rules in place to try to expedite that. Other states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin do a very poor job of that. In some states, some counties are much more efficient than others in terms of how they handle that process. So we want, I think, in some respects, quick results because that instills some confidence. There's an expectation that, listen, we finished voting hours ago, and you've been counting them all. They're all sitting there. Like, how long does it take to run them? We have a machine that does it. It's actually much faster than doing it by hand. But in a technical sense, you're right. We won't actually know the true total for another week or two after that election night. There's ballots that are coming in. There are provisional ballots that have to be cured. There's sometimes we may make a mistake and we have to correct things. And so there's a true total that comes later when we certify the results. And I think states are trying to put as much as they can on election night to move things as quickly as possible. And I think it used to be also that when margins were wide, people concede elections quickly, right? It didn't take very long for John McCain to concede in 2008. Why? It was pretty obvious who the winner was going to be. In other elections, it takes weeks sometimes. So part of it is also the present political moment, where we're so closely divided, and the elections are so contested, and things are so close, it can be a real challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, let's go over here.
Hi, Derek. Thank you for your presentation. It was really good. I just have a question. It might be a little bit simpler, it might not be, but I'm gonna be doing my second election voting. That might make some people here feel old. I'm sorry about that. But I was posed with an interesting question from my sister yesterday, who just recently turned 18, and she's going into her first election. And she asked me who I was voting for. And I think back to the first time I had this opportunity and platform. I was a teenager, and I was thinking not with my head on like what the things were I was on in the community. And being from Wisconsin, it was even felt like there was a little bit more pressure with my vote. But it kind of raised this question where, as I was reflecting and trying to curate on how to long-winded tell her I don't know yet, that when I look to see what each candidate is representing and what they're actually looking for, I go to what I see on the news, the media, and all that. And I realize over the past, in my election time, has been really curated in a lens of this, not necessarily this is what I'm gonna do, but what my candidate isn't gonna do. So the question I pose to you is, how can I inform my sister about how to properly go about doing or choosing an electoral candidate based on a bunch of media, or like how do I filter out the media that is so like anti the other candidate?
Yeah. How to become an informed electorate is a hard thing. And finding the right sources is another hard thing. So one thing I try to tell people is I try to look at what people have done more than what they promise to do. Whether it's you can think about the presidential election, you can think about the congressional election here in Iowa, you can think about the judicial retention elections in Iowa. Most of these candidates are not unknown. They have served in government in various stages or positions. They've had certain positions. They've done certain things. And that to me is the clearest indication of the kinds of things they will do in the future. And I'm sure the stockbrokers in here will say past performance is not an indicator of future success, right? You can say that. I suppose that's right, but I think there's a different one, which is that human nature can be pretty stubborn and hard to change. So I think we can think about some of those past positions and so that's one of the things that I try to look to. So whether it's voting records, whether it's their own actions, the bills they've introduced, the speeches they've given, whatever it might be, those are the kinds of things that to me inform the most about what their future behavior might be. And I think this is especially true for local candidates. I think local newspapers do a pretty good job of getting local candidates on the record with a handful of things. And when you read those and you see those things, you can pretty quickly see the themes arise about the things they prioritize and the value and the things they don't. So I also encourage people to sort of get into the local newspaper for the local issues, to think about what those local candidates are saying and to make those evaluations. So those are the two things, at least to me, that jump out in ways to avoid sort of the filtering mechanism sometimes of what other people might be saying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you were here before. Let's stay on this side for now, and then we'll come over here next.
Oh, okay. Just give you some context for the question I'm about to ask. I'm only 28, so this will be my third election that I've been voting in. Kind of similar to that young man. I guess it's his second. I'm a little more experienced. Barely. I've also stayed up on election night with my mom prior to that. And I gotta tell you, I find this narrative, and I see the newspapers already priming it up, I find this narrative extremely questionable, that we will not know who the winner is on election night. Because in my experience, that fact about the 2020 election was utterly unprecedented. We've always known who the winner was on election night. And they just so happened to find hundreds of thousands of votes overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, only in every single swing state. And you're telling me we can have faith in the electoral process. You don't find that suspicious at all. And it just so happened to be in the middle of this COVID hysteria where they were incentivizing mass mail-in voting on an unprecedented scale. I mean, how convenient. And lastly, the idea that Joe Biden, the least popular president, one of the least popular presidents with the lowest approval ratings in the history of the United States, got more votes than Barack Obama or Donald Trump, and he's the most popular president in history, got the more vote. You don't find any of those things suspicious? I find that narrative, frankly, ridiculous. And I'm wondering how you can even say that.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to think about a couple things in response to that. So in terms of like the closeness of elections and knowing the election results, there's no question that if we think about 2008, 2012, they were not close elections. And we knew very quickly the results. 2004, we didn't really know until the next day because it was a very close election. 2000, we didn't know for 6 weeks. And in the historical sort of modern era, I think in the late 20th century, we had a lot of landslide elections. And now we're in an era that's a little bit more divided and a little bit more challenging to ascertain sort of the will of the electorate, and a lot more divisions that have sewn up in a sense of some uncertainty. And so again, 2000, 2004, 2016 to a lesser degree in 2020. So we have those challenges. Another is, I think there's no question that when people look at the 2020 election, it is a place where there's a lot of distrust. There's no question about it. But when I was here in Iowa, I was here in 2020. I was involved in a recount in this congressional district that was decided by 6 votes. That's when you're looking very closely at the ballots cast. You could say it's Iowa. It's not what happens elsewhere in the United States. But there's no question that every state has lots of systems in place. That is, when you go to vote, you check in to register. And it logs who you are when you're there, and especially in states like Georgia, it's a digital voter registration system when you show up. And then you vote. You've got a piece of paper, and we've got those ballots, and we can identify how many ballots there were because of how many were printed and how many show up. So we have systems in place that check for these things, and so we can identify different stages of the process. How many registered voters came in? How many ballots went through the machine? How many physical ballots have we counted? And when those things line up, and in states like Georgia, they actually counted them 3 times, we can find those things line up. And there's no question that there are things that I think, instances that show distrust in places in the United States, in different places. I can sit here and describe my anecdotes or my experience and try to shore up the confidence. But I think there's no question that there's not a lot of confidence in thinking about how those election results play out. 2020 was an election filled with a lot of skepticism and doubt, and I think COVID and the isolation that people had sort of fueled that, and that was an unfortunate thing too. But when I look at the 2020 election, I see a flawed process. Like all elections have degrees of flaw, but I see nothing sort of that happened what I would label as at scale in terms of systemic problems.
Well, Thank you. I won't stand up here and debate you, but I'm still not buying it.
Okay, thank you.
You can come and talk afterwards. Thank you. Let's go over here.
First, thank you. I appreciate it. My brain's full, so I appreciate that. And I apologize if this is a little off topic. It's more philosophical, but you started off talking about faith. Mm-hmm. And does the definition of faith include what we are willing to give as a result of holding an idea true? That is, what it would cost us. Is faith more than mental assent to something, as some may think? Rather, it includes a willingness that it could or it does cost us everything, and we're okay with that. I would say that's faith. And do you think that the eroding public faith in democracy is associated with the public's lack of willingness to give for what they believe, to give of themselves? And finally,
it's getting real philosophical. Okay, go on. Jung,
who's one of my favorites, says, thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge. Would you agree?
Well, on the last one, I'm not sure. I think we definitely react very quickly to things. I think sometimes we try to take informational shortcuts as often as we can, and maybe sometimes that is judging more than thinking. I'm not sure. Maybe. In terms of the faith, well, that's a really interesting thought. And actually, it would be a reason why I would probably further be resistant to using language like faith for democracy. To the extent that we believe in Christ's salvific power, we should, of course, be willing to give everything for that end, right? That makes sense. That's exactly what we want to do. But the notion that some human institution or government, something that we should do that for. And that's a very sensitive issue because there's no question. We call on people in our armed services to give the last full measure of devotion for their country. There's no question that that's what we expect and hope and want to see. But at the same time, there's like a piece of us that would say, that's, in our governmental system, that sometimes the system is not one that we should give ourselves wholly over to and be willing to be put on a cross, burned by the side of the road, thrown into a lion's den, right? Like, there is some sense in which we are separated from the worldly institution, despite being intensely involved in it. And I don't have easy answers to think about. When are those times where we do give our all and give into it, and when are those times we hold back? Like, how do we think about that? I don't have an answer for that tonight, but it's making me think now, and it is philosophical, but I appreciate that.
Hello. I'd like to get your opinion on mandatory voting as they have in Australia. Should America have mandatory voting laws? And as a background for myself, I am a political volunteer, door knocker, phone banker. I've been doing it for over 25 years. And let me just tell you, because of those contacts, I got, my son and myself, a visit into the West Wing of the White House through those political contacts. So I ask that question as a person who is steeped in politics.
Yeah.
I have no compunction to speak to, maybe even this gentleman tonight who doesn't believe the election of 2020 was valid. So I'd like to know what you think about voting mandatory.
Yeah.
Should America have mandatory voting laws? And to say, you're probably more familiar with Australia than I am. I may not be getting it right, but...
Where are my Australian friends in the audience?
Can I add to that a little bit? Because I had a similar question. So he's asking about mandatory voting, right?
Yeah.
And you did mention earlier that not voting is an option, right? And I think a lot of people today maybe are having trouble getting on board voting for a candidate. There's so much seems to be voting against someone. But then others might not be able to vote for anyone with a clear conscience, right? And so they might choose to sit out, and that is a choice that we can make now. But as citizens, we can make that choice. But what are the obligations and responsibilities as followers of Christ do we have towards engaging in this process and being a part of it? And then also, does that analysis and does the result change if we're talking about like presidential elections versus local elections and the responsibility of engaging in those?
Yeah, I mean, so on mandatory voting, one is, it's something sometimes the political scientists like to think about, but there's something, and I can only just be descriptive about this, there's something so antithetical to the American experience to force them to do something, right? I mean, okay, we have the draft, and you have to pay your taxes. There are things we do force Americans to do, right? But anytime you're going to put an obligation on Americans, it's just sort of so countercultural. So at one level, it's like even hard to think about it because it would be so hard to even think about how it would operate in the United States to think about mandatory voting. In Australia, when we think about mandatory voting includes putting a blank ballot in the machine. You can vote. You can not fill out the ballot as long as you return it. As long as you've done that, then you will not be fined. So there's also a little bit of artifice there to say that there's mandatory voting. But again, so we have some Australian friends, I think, who are in town who sometimes, I think, have done that in the past. Or we could talk, because if you don't live in Australia and you still have to have that obligation. So there are ways to think about it in which it could be sort of a challenge about even how we conceptualize mandatory voting. I think there's no question that today we talk about, can people vote? Is it easy to vote? How many opportunities are there to vote? There's so much effort to go get people to vote and to knock on doors and to make them do. So I think there are different trade-offs to thinking about the mandatory side. But for the obligation, again, I mean, there's not a lot of voting in Scripture, right? As you've seen, it's a lot of casting of lots or a lot of divine selection. Those are your voting options. So it's a lot of things instead where we're thinking about matters of Christian conscience, being deliberative, engaging in prayer, engaging with your neighbors, and thinking about what ought I do. And again, I don't begrudge people if they're too busy and don't feel comfortable like with some of those local races they're just not familiar with, or they just have distaste, or they have distrust, or whatever those things are, right? There are ways in which you can be sort of reflective and engage, but I think there's no question that we have an obligation being in this world, to being part of this world, to have participation in the political process to some degree. And that might be varying degrees for different people, right? And I totally understand that. Not all of us can be experts in everything, and there are going to be trade-offs when it comes to that. But I think there is at least an obligation to take these things seriously, to think about them and engage with them. So, all right.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the group Braver Angels?
I am not.
Oh, it's interesting because you were describing if we could come in discourse in more harmony.
Yeah.
And Braver Angels tries to reach out to all parties and get them to talk in confrontational ways and seek to understand what the other people are doing. But I found it a very interesting organization.
Okay. I found, so the University of Iowa Law School, I don't know if you've participated in
Across the
Aisle.
Yeah.
I was talking about that a little bit today. There are spaces being made for people to meet, again, in a post-COVID era, in a digital age, in an era where people are increasingly isolated. How can we have people with intense disagreements engage in conversation with each other, even if they disagree? And sometimes the best thing is to talk to someone who disagrees with you, not to change their mind, but to know that there's a human being who can have radically different views from your own, and to learn what motivates them and have a conversation with them. And so for this, at Iowa, at the law school there, it would be, we're going to talk about immigration, gun control, abortion. They're not hiding on the small subjects, right? And these are 22 to 30-year-olds who are having the conversations, right? And they're able to come away from it and realize, okay, I've never talked to somebody who had this view on this subject. I've never had that. So how can we do that? And again, we can spend a long time thinking about all the wisdom in Proverbs, or what James 1 says about the tongue and how we engage and how we speak about these things. But it would be nice if we had more of those, and especially in the church, if there are people who have disagreements with each other, how can we facilitate those? So I'll follow up with you more about that. Yeah. But okay.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Yeah. Do you have a benediction, John, you want to give? No, okay. So thank you all for coming tonight. Again, Derek, thank you and Emily for making the trip out. Hopefully this was an encouragement to you as you enter into this potentially difficult season. And I think just one of the things, at least for me, was a takeaway, is just talking about being a people of Proverbs 18:17. And I think just as you were sharing, what it means to humanize the other in this season where I think even I have to confess it's easy for me to dehumanize what would be the opposing viewpoint, right? And so as Christians who have been given a great humanity as a gift in Christ, we have an opportunity to extend this ability to humanize each other in a season where there's much dehumanizing happening. So just a little exhortation there, and just an incredible lecture, and again, encouragement from Derek. And so if you liked what you heard, you can also hear more occasionally on CNN in this, next month or so, maybe longer perhaps. But also you can follow Derek on Twitter. You have a handle maybe, or no?
It's Derek T. Muller, but you don't have to follow me on Twitter. It's okay.
You can just observe him on Twitter. You don't have to follow him on Twitter. But yeah, thank you again, Derek. And then if you would like to stick around and ask a few questions, perhaps, Derek can make himself available. So thank you again for coming tonight, and thank you again, Derek.
Thanks, John. Hey.